number 7, which is not the triangles. And what you'll see is that there'll be a review of the triangles within this section. So as soon as everybody's settled, we'll get started. We asked maybe we could get chairs that make more noise, but it was discovered that there is no such thing as a chair that makes more noise than the noise that these chairs make. So what we're going to do today is, as you've seen, what we're trying to do is to develop a way of thinking about the number 1, which is not erased when we go to the number 2. To go to the number 2, which is not erased when we go to the number 3. That was triangles, that was last time. And now we're about to try to understand how to understand more than 3. Now what you can immediately see is, for example, the Bryce family. Everybody's getting familiar with the Bryce family? The Bryce family has 5 people. There are an awful lot of triangles there. If you try to sort everything out by dyads, by sides of a triangle, you'll end up with too much information. And one of the things that therapists have to do is focus. And when a therapist is seeing a family, the focus means you make choices. And that means that there's some things that you pay a lot of attention to and other things that you let go by while you're trying to decide on the focus and what you're doing. A family therapist is not a passive individual. Now, there are families or couples where if they're highly differentiated enough, they will let you act as if you're just taking care of 2 individuals simultaneously and it's all working fine. But that's not the majority of the people that you'll see. And once you get past the number 3, you'll find that you have to take some leadership in the family. You have to take some leadership, which is not what you learn in generic counseling. As a matter of fact, it's sort of what you learn not to do in generic counseling. In generic counseling or in therapy, you generally see yourself as following the client and learn how to accept things, how to let it come from them, how not to be intrusive, all those good things that you learn, which are not useful in the focus in the family. They're useful once you have the focus. Once you're talking to somebody in a session, you talk to that person the way you talk to a person, right? But how you choose who you're talking to and how you manage the other people in the room while you're talking to somebody, or how you get them to talk to each other, that's family therapy. It's an expansion. It's not that you have to unlearn something, but you have to be willing to take on a kind of leadership role, because that's what the family gives you and that's what the family wants from you. Now, when it comes to thinking about numbers larger than 3, the easiest way into family systems is what's called the structural approach. And the structural approach in Israel is pretty much called family therapy. In other words, when family therapy was started in Israel, it was pretty much defined by this way of doing it. And the truth is that in a lot of places in the States, when you say family therapy, you mean this. This has a name attached to it. The name attached to it is Salvador Minuchin. And Minuchin, people have heard of Minuchin? Yeah, so you know, the first and most well-known book, aside from The Family Crucible, was Minuchin's book. It's a long time ago now, on family systems and family therapy. He ended up writing a whole series of books afterwards. And the theory behind it is the way that people think about families. It's a limited theory. It has to be critiqued. It did not pass muster of the feminist critique of the world and everything around it in the 1990s. And so we want to see what's in it that we can use and what we need to improve in order to be able to think past the certain levels of chauvinism that are part of this theory. But first of all, let's try to learn the theory. So what we're doing today is learning what's called the structure of a family. The structure is a different word from the systemic approach. You'll see when we get, now is a structure not a system isn't the structure, what are we talking about here? But in the second half of the 20th century, the approach of looking at structures and the approach of looking at systems was somewhat different. It was different philosophically, it was different in different schools of thinking, and I think what you'll see here is the advantages of the simplifications of a structure and the disadvantages of the simplification of the structure. And so here we go. Bryce, you getting friendly with them? David is a lawyer, Caroline, I forget what she does. They have an older daughter who's Aftsoris, who's 15, and a boy named Don, and a girl named Laura. And the genogram you're all familiar with, right? Men are square, women are round, genogram. Now, there are three main categories of thought that are essential to the structure. It's only three. It's not too many. The first one is that there's hierarchy, right? In a structure, there's levels of authority. Hierarchy is actually, the word hierarchy comes from the Kohanim, because in Greek, hieros is a priest. So the original hierarchy were Kohanim, Leviim, Yisrael, but here in the family, hierarchy means that the word here does not mean higher. It's not an English word, it's a Greek word from the priest. It means that some people have more authority than others. So the simple way of looking at it is that there's a hierarchical division between parents and children. That's very popular these days. Somebody's made a whole career out of it. It doesn't go very far into English. In Hebrew, it's a big deal about the rehabilitation of the authority of the parents. There's authority in parents. Why is there authority in parents? Because children need authority. Remember when we talked about the person who needs a commander? The commander doesn't force himself, and that that Yitzchak in our example Rivka doesn't force him to need a mother. He needs a mother, right? So children need authority. And so there's a hierarchical division between the parents and children. So far, so good. And so sometimes you'll see a family, and you'll see that the kids are all over the parents, and the parents say things and the kids don't listen, or they're insulting to the parents. And you say to yourself, this was the most famous Minution maneuver, that we have to put the hierarchy back into order, that the parents are not able to assert their authority. And if you think about it mutually, we like to use the word mutual here, that means that the children are lost. They don't have the authority that they need. It's not that the parents need the authority, the children need the authority of parents. So you see the kids running all over the parents, and you say, wait a minute here. The first thing we're going to do, that's already leadership, is instead of saying, how is it that it's like this, how does it feel to you all, you will say, okay, how about if you get your kids to shut up so the two of you can talk? A little bit milder than that. Minution was actually less mild than that. And the favorite in New York, in the days when Minution was riding high, Minution's trainees always referred to children as snot-nosed children. Now, I'm a child person, so I'm not particularly enamored of that, but the idea was that these kids need to have authority. Some kids need to have more authority. It needs to be the right kind of authority, but the authority, that's the first hierarchical line, okay? So it's a pretty straightforward, would you call it a concept? It's close to a concept, sort of like a concept. Now there's two other hierarchical lines, and those will depend on the age difference between the children. In other words, and particularly in Haredi families, where there are big families and some of the children are much older than the other ones and are often given responsibility, and you cannot be given responsibility without authority. Correct? If you start to have responsibility when you don't have authority, you end up with a confusion. So when a mother says to her 11-year-old girl, take care of the six-year-old and younger for a couple of hours, she's investing her with authority. And if she hasn't told the younger children that this girl, she's your mother now. She has the authority that I'm giving her, and if you don't listen to her, then you're not listening to me. Then you have a total mess, right? So if you have, let's say, a difference of 3 or 4 years between the children, then you have 2 other hierarchical lines, and the question is how that's being managed. Okay, first notion is authority or hierarchy. Now, there's a second, and this is really the most important notion, which is that within a system there is subsystems. Subsystems means groups of people whose function is mutual. You know, they have to do it together. That doesn't mean, a subsystem doesn't mean a collection of people. It's a functional collection of people. It's people who are doing the same thing. They're responsible for the same thing. So for example, when you take David and Caroline are members of 2 subsystems. Just the 2 of them together, but they're members of 2 subsystems. A system is defined by function. So parents have 2 functions. One is a spouse function, and one is a parental or executive or, authoritative. We're calling it parental. Venusian used the word executive. I don't know why Americans like the word executive, but let's call it parental. So see that you don't put a circle around David and Caroline and say, David and Caroline, that's the subsystem. David and Caroline belong to 2 subsystems, right? One is parental, and one is a spouse subsystem. And then,
Are subsystems always defined by function?
Yes, that is the definition of subsystems. It's by function, not by members. So there's also a sibling subsystem, and that, siblings don't do what parents do. Siblings do different things, like make fun of their parents, or realize what could be better, or take care of each other and are close when they're all put in the same room and they go to sleep together. They do things that parents don't do. They're members of a subsystem. So there's
members of 2? Wouldn't they be members of 2?
2 what subsystems?
Siblings and children? Yeah, children, parent, children.
Well, you could say that. You could say that, that's actually a good point, and that actually is not only a good point, it's a very good point, because it was missed. You see, when you're doing family therapy, you actually do that. Whereas Venusian was so busy with the hierarchy that he missed one of the subsystems. Because what siblings do together, aside from listening to parents, they do a lot of things other than listening to parents, right? So what they do between themselves and what they do as the children who listen to the parents are 2 separate subsystems. Okay? So now you have a chiddush right here in the room online. But aside from the content, the process is important. You saw 2 different functions. The function of what siblings do together will show up in family therapy. Sometimes it's crucial in family therapy that the parents are so busy with authority that they're not letting the kids do things that siblings do together, because maybe the parents didn't have a good sibling system themselves, right? And they don't trust it. But what siblings do together when they're just by themselves, aside from parental authority, is indeed another subsystem. And then, now, you would say, since you made this comment, you would say, why didn't Venusian see this, right? And that's exactly what the feminist critique of Venusian's theory was from the 1990s on. That Venusian saw what Venusian saw. Venusian saw his own family, he saw what was familiar to him, and he missed some stuff. So you would say, how about if we asked Venusian how it was with his siblings? Because he seems to have missed it in his theory. Good point. Okay. So we have a chiddush here. And then you see there's a subsystem of the whole nuclear family together. That a nuclear family is a subsystem in what? In an expanded family, right? In other words, this is, and what do you say, why do you call it a subsystem? Because a nuclear family is part of a larger group, but it has functions that nuclear families do, and that other members of the extended family don't do. So it's functional. Yeah?
In the book, I'm trying to think, did they not include siblings? Like I remember John, not having, him not coming, and then, or Laura making everything brighter, or like how Claudia affects Dawn, do they not account for siblings, or is that kind of how they just affected David, Caroline, and the whole family system?
Right. Well, see, I'm completing this, and when it's complete, I'll know who all of you are. But you're Elisheva, correct? Okay. So, all right, there we go. See, we get something out of these pictures here. So those of you who haven't put in your pictures, I don't like to talk to people whose names I don't know. So you're on here, so it takes me a while. The pictures help me to remind. So you're doing it for me, not for you. So it's I can remember names. What we're learning now is the way Minuchin looks at families.
Oh, that wasn't the same thing?
No, parallel to Minuchin. You see, one of the reasons I want you to read the family system, the family crucible, is that Whitaker makes it up as he goes along. And that's what you're going to do. You're going to make it up as you go along. Because all of this theory is in the back of your mind, and sometimes at a good moment, after a session, you'll say to yourself, oh, I could have done that. And 2 or 3 years down the road, it'll occur to you in a session. Ah, look at this. That's here it is, right? But in the meantime, you're not really using theory. You're using yourself, and then you're thinking theory, between sessions. So Whitaker there's not a word about this in the family crucible, right? And there's also not a word about Bowen, and there's not a word about mutuality. Right? That's the whole idea, that you have more than one way of thinking of things. So I'm trying to give you one way of thinking, and then there's others. So what goes on in the sibling system of Claudia, Don, and Laura, now that Elisheva has let out the secret that you're reading the book, which is a good thing.
Oh, were we not supposed to?
You're supposed to be reading the book.
I missed last class, so maybe I...
No. That's a good example for everybody, because if you can think about Claudia, Don, and Laura, that's our example for this whole year. Right? That we'll all have the same example. It's a pretty lively example. It's treated in a different way, but you can think about, well, what about the sibling system of Claudia, Don, and Laura? Was that being paid attention to in the therapy? And what do you think?
As maybe not as a goal, but as a tool in the thing to be able to use how they affect each other.
Right.
I guess when I think about it, all brought it back to the parental system and the triangle of Claudia, mostly.
That's right. In other words, the central triangle, as we'll see in a minute, is David, Caroline, and Claudia. And so since that's a central triangle, the therapist chooses to focus on that, on the assumption that the other triangles will get solved if you solve the central one. And that in our terms, the differentiation of the family will rise when the central triangle turns into a triad, when there's mutuality in each of the 3 sides of the triangle. We're talking the same language here? So as a result, there were times when you could say, gee, I wish that they would have just let David and Caroline alone for an hour and talk about Claudia, Don, and Laura. What kind of an older sister is Claudia to Don? What kind of older siblings are Don and Claudia to Laura? What kind of a younger sister is Laura? That never really happens. It happens, I think you said it very correctly, that they use it sometimes, but to get back to the central triangle. But if you were doing the treatment, and you said to yourself, David and Caroline, would it be possible for the 2 of you just to sit here with me? You see, in family therapy, you tell people where to sit. In other words, you move around the chairs. The person who created moving around the chairs, everybody's seen family therapists moving chairs around? That's Minuchin. The person who did that most was Minuchin. You would say, listen, how about David and Caroline, you sit here with me and let your kids talk about how they want to have an evening together without having to deal with all the struggles in the family. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's not what they did, right? Which we want to give you flexibility. So that's right on the mark. So the nuclear family is a subsystem, and the nuclear family does things that the extended family does not do. Now, yeah.
Just a nuclear family is always referring to married parents and children.
Right. No, that's and the question is because, wait a second, there are families where nuclear family functions include other people, like mostly grandma, right? And it might be an older brother. In other words, it really depends on how the extended family is structured.
If the parents are divorced, is that still a nuclear family? Would you refer to it?
Oh, so in divorce, what you see is you have no. You have two nuclear families.
Right.
What you have, one of the challenges of divorce is how to keep the parental subsystem alive when the spouse subsystem no longer works. And one of the big mistakes that often happens in divorce treatment is to bring in the parents together, and they can't sit together as parents because they're too angry or hurt as spouses, right? So you have to figure out how to make the parents work in some way that doesn't keep slipping over the fact that they're no longer spouses, and they may be glad that they're not, and then there may be other spouses, and that becomes more complicated. So in a divorced family, you'll have a parental subsystem working in some way or other, hopefully at least live and let live. If it's in harmony, that's even better, but at least live and let live. But the spouse system is broken. There is no spouse system at this point. There may be other spouse systems. But your question was, what about other people? Now, that depends on culture. For example, anybody who worked with the Puerto Rican community in New York knows that Carolyn's mother is part of the nuclear family. In other words, in terms of nuclear family function, which is taking care of the kids, authority over the kids, supporting the family financially, and in some ways being a part of, there's like a spouse system that kind of includes abuela. And if you don't understand that, and you say, well, that shouldn't be, you're not understanding a culture. And if you look at Haredi culture, and there's more than one Haredi community, you'll see that what exactly is a nuclear family is created by a certain kind of culture. Western advanced monopoly capitalism created the nuclear family. No one ever lived in families before that. In nuclear families, everybody lived next door to their aunt and their older sister, and so the idea of the nuclear family and the boundaries, we'll get to boundaries in a minute, between the nuclear family and the extended family is a completely culturally sensitive issue. So we don't want to start to say that Mnuchin decides what a nuclear family is. Mnuchin says that there's nuclear family functions. You meet a family and you say, who does these functions? Who are the people involved? Who are the partners? And if abuela is part of the nuclear family, then it doesn't make sense to do family therapy and not invite abuela, right? Until she decides, what part she's in and what part she's out. So when you invite families, you may be inviting older sisters. If you're in the Palestinian Arab community, the father's older brother is part of the nuclear family because he's the head of the clan and he has a major role in it. And so forth. You had a question first?
I was wondering if the family is very big, very large.
Right.
Could there be more than one nuclear family?
Yeah.
What defines a nuclear family? Like, what would be how do you know that the grandmother is involved?
Right. Well, say to yourself, what does a nuclear family do? They provide for the kids, and they discipline the kids. They help kids to grow up together. And this is an issue of finances. So a lot of times you may have two different nuclear families that seem to be kind of blended. The question will be, and that's what we're about to get to, how it functions. The function of the subsystem is what determines the therapy, right? So if it's functioning well and it doesn't look like Mnuchin's family, Mnuchin actually, just so you know, Mnuchin was a child psychiatrist who came from Argentina to Israel in the early 50s, one of the leading places in child mental health. That's unfortunately no longer the case, but one of the leading places in the world in child mental health was the Lasker Clinic in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a world-class training institution. Eric Erickson was here, and Gerald Kaplan was the director of the Lasker Clinic. Kaplan later became the inventor of consultation and community psychiatry at Harvard, and a lot of interesting people were here. One of the trainees was Salvador Mnuchin, who worked with kibbutzim, and it was working with kibbutzim that he got the idea about systems. Right? So we're dealing with something that comes back to Israel in the 70s, when Mnuchin comes back and trains or talks to the Kibbutzim movement, and there's somebody named Mordechai Kaufman who became the sort of the central person in family therapy in Israel. And Mordechai Kaufman was a good friend. Mnuchin used to come every year or two. So there's a lot of Mnuchin around here. One of the difficulties in Israel is to get free of Mnuchin. In other words, to take in what's useful and to go past it. But das ist von unsers. I mean, this way of doing it is both, it's an Israeli invention, half Israeli invention.
The place called?
Well, it was called the Lasker Clinic. It was in the 50s. Anybody remember what was going on in Israel in the 50s? There was no money. There was no money. Nobody could make a parnasa anyway. And an awful lot of talented people didn't stay, including Mnuchin. What?
That's why it fell apart.
Yeah. I mean, there was no money at all. And people were rationing butter. You know, it was a period of hard times. So we lost an awful lot of people. What's that?
They're laughing, they're still rationing butter.
Never mind butter.
Right. So far, so good? So you see...
In other words, with each individual family, you
Right.
really have to explore what their nuclear family is.
Correct. In other words, what Debbie's saying is the right clinical guideline. That you take this idea of functions and boundaries, and we're about to get the boundary and subsystems, and you say, how does this family work? What works for this family? And if they're coming for therapy, you say what works. First you say what works, then you say, well, what's not working? You know, how we can help them to function better.
What about a housekeeper?
What's that?
I'm so serious. What about a housekeeper? My husband's family's housekeeper is like, she's a part of the family. She came to our wedding. She sat at the same table.
Oh, right.
I heard of a housekeeper. Didn't you tell us that story of the housekeeper?
No, it was me.
What? Wait, we have... Now, my role in our system is to tell people to be quiet if other people are trying to talk, because I can't hear everybody at once. So we want to hear what you have to say, but just a minute. What?
No, the housekeeper, didn't you tell us that story? Something
Is a housekeeper a part of a nuclear family?
was making decisions in the family?
That was Dr. Love.
Dr. Levitt.
Oh, Dr. Levitt.
They brought the housekeeper and the dog to the couple's
Right.
dog. That's what it was.
So now you see, a housekeeper, you say, all right, well, this is the subsystem. It's not supposed to include the help, the help, right, the hired help. But the question is how it works. In other words, you could say, well, the housekeeper is filling in a vacuum because mom and dad can't figure anything out, so she figures for them. And that's not going to work for the kids because the kids see that their parents are, or it could be that mom and dad really like this housekeeper. They think that she's like a sort of a extra auxiliary parent for them as well, or an aunt. And they agree with her function, and so you should invite her into the therapy. In other words, she's part of the system. Now, it used to be that that's how all families were. In other words, it used to be that in the 1800s, in the middle class at least, that nobody really was taken care of by their parents. That you were always raised by some sort of a nanny, and that nanny became as important and stayed with the family for years. And as you know, in biblical times, you know, Meneket Rivka, people stayed with the people who raised them. It wasn't only their parents. So that's a function, raising you, giving you milk, raising you, talking to you, mutuality. And if that's the function that's involved, then those people belong, considered as part of the treatment. You see, if you would say, no, a housekeeper shouldn't be part of treatment, you may be using your culture and not the family's culture. So it's exactly the point that any given family, you say, how does this system work? You don't take systems theory and say, how should this system work? First you say, how does it work? And then based on that, you see how it could work better. One of the famous housekeepers was the person who made a Jew named Sigmund Freud hate religion. And that was his Catholic nanny, who, you know, in Vienna there weren't too many Jewish nannies, so there was this Catholic nanny. She used to take him to church, and he got turned off from that, and for the rest of his life he thought that was religion. So we took a hit there. Now, we talked about hierarchy and we talked about subsystems. Now we're going to talk about boundaries. Now, boundaries is where Minuchin's theory slips, because Minuchin thought that the way that you have to treat a family is to reconstruct its boundaries. And let's take a look at how Minuchin thought, and then we'll see how we think. You can, if anybody wants to just stay with Minuchin, it's okay. You see, here you have David and Caroline, and you have a spouse subsystem in one color, and a parental subsystem, the same two people. So what is a boundary between one subsystem and the other subsystem? One is taking care of the kids, and the other is the spouse subsystem. What's the boundary between them? It's not a boundary between people, it's a boundary between functions. What would that boundary be? How would it look like? Well, the simple form of it is, listen, if you don't come home and take care of your kids, I think I'll have a headache tonight, right? So then you're imposing on the spouse subsystem, or the marital sexual satisfaction system, because of things with the kids. They're supposed to be separate, supposed to be, but that would be where you would have a boundary. You separate the functions. Say, couples would say, never go to bed angry. So whatever it is with the kids, you put it aside and you leave the spouse subsystem alone. Does that work for everybody? Hallelujah. But that would be a way of a boundary. Now, if the boundaries are between subsystems, and subsystems are functional, right? So a correct boundary between David and Caroline's subsystems would be a boundary that preserves the function of the subsystem, right? In other words, when you say, how should the boundary be between the parental system and the spouse system, there isn't any should be. The question is, does the boundary, the way you do it, preserve the spouse function and the parental function? If it preserves the function of each subsystem, then the boundary is good, even if it doesn't look like the boundary in my family. That's where the women criticized Minuchin. Minuchin came in and said, this is how the boundary should be, and there's a lot of room for how boundaries should be. Minuchin's terms for boundaries were either they're loose or they're too tight, right? And so he had two different kinds of families. We'll get to that in a minute. Family with boundaries that are too tight, families with boundaries that are too loose. And he was the little bear who knew what was just right, what the boundary should be. But he wasn't looking at it functionally. He was looking at it as how boundaries should be. That was a little slip of chauvinism. But if you look at it in terms of how is the function inside each subsystem, then you're using the boundaries as a tool to get to the function in the subsystem. And the function in the subsystem is going to be based on mutuality and co-creation, right? In other words, the whole idea of in the subsystem, that's where the differentiation is going to be expressed by people being able to co-create. That's inside. So you want boundaries that allow the subsystems, that support the subsystems and allow them to be places for co-creation. So a boundary is actually not the, you said before something about using the siblings as a tool, but not as a goal. So the boundaries are a tool. The goal is the function of the subsystem. The function of subsystem is where there's co-creation. Okay? So now if we look, for example, at, here's the, there's a system of the siblings, right? And let's take that as you added one of them being warm with each other, but let's talk about it in terms of they're listening to their parents. So then, if David and Caroline are telling Claudia what time to come home, and Don starts to stand on his head and distract them, so Don is interrupting, he's crossing a boundary between the parental subsystem because he's not supposed to be there. If he starts to argue about what do you mean she has to come home, or if she can come home, I can come home. So he's crossing a boundary between the parental subsystem and the child subsystem. Making executive decisions belongs with the parents. sort of. So, so then you would say, well, Don is crossing the boundary. And in Minuchin therapy, the leadership of the therapist would be to say, Don, come here, sit with me, and let your parents talk. You see, when you say, come here, sit with me, let your parents make this decision, you're what's called restructuring the family. You're creating or reinforcing a boundary in order to allow for a function between the parents. That, you know, they want to talk about whether Claudia should come home at 2 or at 3 in the morning, and Don is interrupting them. So we take Don, either we have them settle things with Don, or we settle things with Don temporarily ourselves, in order to let the parents talk. However, what happens if you just leave Don alone, and David and Caroline continue to talk, and they successfully have the conversation, and Don is doing his thing, but they continue to function? So that means that the boundary for this family is working okay. It might annoy the therapist might not want it in his family, but if the parents are able to have the conversation, which is the function of the subsystem, then Don's boundary is adequate for the parents to function. You see what I mean? And Minuchin would always take the kid out. The kid is always a snot-nosed kid. The kid always should be sort of separated from the system, even when they didn't need it. Yeah.
So in other words, with a family where, let's say, the parents are kind of like best friends with their kids, you know, there's a lot of families like that, as long as it's working for them, there's no reason to change it, you're saying?
Exactly. In other words, if that's a good 21st century example. Minuchin would probably say that's not good because they're crossing boundaries, but you're saying, well, if the parents are able to make their decisions, and, you know, David and Caroline are talking, the authorities with David and Caroline, and Don says, why don't you guys just say 2:30 instead of fighting about 2 or 3? How about if you just say 2:30? Now, Minuchin would say, a snot-nosed kid, sticking his nose into crossing the boundary, take him out and let the parents talk. But if you just wait a second, and David and Caroline say, he always reminds us of the common sense that we always forget, and go back to they make the decision. It's not Don's decision, it's their decision, then what's the matter with that? Right? So that's exactly where you would say that the family, you ask yourself, is there authority in the parental system that's adequate to the functioning of the family? And if you call it friendly or not friendly, there's a great range there of what might work. Okay? Yeah.
I was just going to say that saying 2:30 to 2 or 3 o'clock doesn't necessarily mean that they're best friends. It happens to be a situation of let's say, equality and of taking an opinion into account as equals, but or as effective.
Give another example. What would it be like if they were best friends? Make it up, you know, from your neighbors.
Yeah, I'm thinking of my own.
Yeah, okay, that's a bad idea. But you're not the only one, right? Right. You see, it makes you think about your own family. You say to yourself, you know, what works, what doesn't work, how do the boundaries, who decides how the boundaries are? Do the boundaries in my family that I'm bringing up, are they similar to the ones that I was brought up with? Are they different? With different spouses, so they probably have to be different, because who creates the boundaries? The spouse system figures out how the boundaries are going to work for them. So
I would say in that case, you know, a little kid who was sitting down and eating junk food with his parents, and the parents not, you know, kind of saying, you know, hey, you decide how much you want to eat. You know, it's good.
right.
You can make your own choices, and the kid's young.
Okay.
Goes ahead and eats whatever he wants to.
Right.
I was thinking of a different age example that's the same thing, which is you had, I don't know if you have it today, but there were times when you had a lot of families that they were sitting around smoking together, and I'm the drug, doing, you know, smoking weed together, or, you know.
Okay, the family that smokes together, tokes together, right. Okay. So, and then you would say to yourself, is this good or is it not good, or is it a family's choice? In other words, within a given culture, is it a family's choice? whatever you do, now go back to your example, and the kid is eating junk food, and his parents are saying to a 4-year-old, you decide what you eat. Now, there are many parents who say, I decide what you eat. You're 4 years old, snot-nosed kid, and I decide what you eat, right? And then they have battles about what you eat if they can't figure out how to make it work, because the kid also lives in a culture where junk food is being pushed in every possible media, and he doesn't want to be different, right? So if the parents say, well, you decide what to eat, they could also say, while they're saying, you decide what you eat, we have our opinions about it. Here's what we would hope for you, right? Is that a bad thing to do? To say, you know, when you're finished eating the 5th bag of bamba, and then you want bisli, which altogether is not such terrible food, but it is not, you know, salad. So, so we say, you know, somewhere between the age of 4 and 40, we're hoping for you that you start to think about what the food does in your system. Can a 4-year-old think about that? No. So now, they're not expecting him to come to a conclusion about the nutrition at the age of 4. Can a 4-year-old know that there are inner organs? That comes at 7. The body is an external surface, and God only knows what goes on inside. It only hurts on the outside until you're 7. That's when, you know, when you have illnesses, that's when children start to think that there are inner organs, because it's not obvious. It's not what's called sensory motor, right? You don't see it. So you have to think through things in a different way. So this kid is not going to be able to figure out. And there's another family that you could say where they're all sitting around eating lettuce, you know, with a hefsher. And they're talking about folic acid, and they're talking about, you know, the wonders of lettuce and some celery and a little bit of petrozilia, and they're all sitting munching a salad, and the kid is happy to be munching with his parents, and he says, you know, this is so much better than what we eat in Gan. We're just making this up, right? But is that a family that's functioning? So you see, there's a range there, and it's very hard to decide for a family what to do about it, how to set the boundaries, because boundaries service function. Boundaries are not by themselves having to be one way or the other. They service the function. And so there are some parents who their authority is looser because it keeps them better in touch with mutuality. And there's some parents who can't afford to loosen the authority, so they're very tight, but at the expense of mutuality. And then there are the perfect families sitting before us here, which who know how to do it all together. So the main point is to understand that boundaries service subsystem function, because subsystem function is where the mutuality and the co-creation takes place. That's where differentiation takes place, not at the boundaries, how you create the boundaries. Oh, creating boundaries. See, there's an interesting story here in Israel, how you translate the word boundary. Because a boundary is not a limit. What's the difference between a boundary and a limit?
One can be a separate.
What?
Come up against the limit. You can't go any further. Boundaries can be crossed and moved back and forth.
A simple way of looking at it is a boundary is something that both sides create together. The way it used to be when America had a boundary with Mexico before, God knows what, but more or less, and fighting with Canada too, but you know, a boundary is like, this is how we run our affairs. We check more things, we don't, but you decide together. It's a mutual creation. Oh, a mutual creation. How do you create, mutual creation? We've heard that before, right? In other words, the differentiation of the family is going to be connected to how they create the boundaries. Boundaries are created between two sides. A limit is something that's imposed on one side. And a lot of times when people talk about parental authority, or they talk about boundaries, what they really mean are limits. And limits is, you can't do that. And not, here's why I think you can't do that, and I'm... What's that?
How do you do a boundary on young kids?
You talk to them...
Young ages.
Right.
The family, how do they mutually create boundaries?
Right. Do you all understand the question? Isn't, with little kids, like under 25, everything has to be imposed on them. And the answer is that's one view of childhood. It's a popular view of childhood. Every 20 years, the popular view of childhood flips. In America, since 1840, it's been flipping. And everybody, when it flips, there are experts who know why it has to be flipped this way, 1840, and why it has to be flipped the other way. Little children participate in life. In other words, when you say to a child no, if you think about it, when does he start to develop his conscience? Conscience is what says no inside. The conscience begins to develop around 3, right? Maybe a little before 3, maybe a little after 3, but somewhere around then, a child is able to say no to himself, right? The 1.5-year-old sticks his finger towards the plug, and just so you know, the Israeli plug is less dangerous than the American plug. Do you know that? The American plug is 110, and the Israeli plug is 220. I mean, every place except America is 220. So the American plug you would think is less dangerous, but the American plug has just the right amount of electricity to make your muscles contract. So you stick your finger in the plug and you can't get it out because it's made your muscles stuck there. Whereas the Israeli plug is 220 and gives you and knocks you away. So it gives you a bigger zap, but it saves you. It pushes you away. Just in case anybody wanted to know, you still cover the plugs. So, but at some point, you know, when you forgot to cover one of the plugs, and the kid is going for it, and you say no. Now, no is the answer, right? It's not functional to say, play with electricity any way you want and learn from experience, especially not in America. So, because the experience is short and unfortunate. But the way you say no, the child takes in, right? So when you say to a child, no, damn it, that's the last, so that's how the child's going to learn to talk to himself, which is not what you want, right? Whereas if you say, you know, we're trying to remember the time that I told you no, and you remember that, and you make it into a game, you say electricity is a no, and you know, do a little dance or something like that. So what are you doing? You're creating an inner voice that the child participates in, that he then can go, and that's what you'll see with little kids, that they'll then go to the plug and say no. That's when you know that you're creating something, that co-creating with them. Right? So you're not imposing it on them, you're giving them something that they can make use of to gradually make it their own. Do you see the difference? So how you say that, the person who taught me this was the head of child psychiatry at Yale, and he used to say, you know, if you would remember that you're creating your child's memories. Right now, online, you're creating their childhood memories. He was a psychoanalyst. He said, it put me out of work, you know. But the way that you say no is the way he's going to say no to himself, which is going to be a kinder way, a more gradual way, an easier way to adopt, or a negative way, and one that says, you know, when there's a no, it's a bad feeling. There's anxiety and there's fear.
It's confused when it comes to safety if we should be like singing songs.
Yeah, no, I'm like, let's run to the street when the car comes. I don't know. I don't think that's the time for
Right.
singing. That's the time for.
Well, I thought that might not go over too well. But you see, see when the finger is about to go to the
You could leave out the curse.
what?
You could leave out the curse. You said no, Blaine. You could leave that part out.
Wait. Debbie's about to say something from experience, so that's better than me just making it up. Yeah. What do you want to say?
I just said you could leave out the cursing part and just be very, you know, very struck, so that a child does develop that sense of
Firmness, yeah.
danger.
Right.
So you want to develop that. You
Right.
want to knock them down.
Well, when the child is on the edge of the mirpeset, you don't start to just do a dance. You take him off of the mirpeset, right? But after you take him off of the mirpeset, then you have to decide what voice you're trying to help him to create inside. It's not the same parenting. It's a different issue. So, you know, danger is danger, and not to respond to danger is an irresponsible parent. And there are parents like that who say, you know, well, you're going to learn from experience. It's a good thing you're only on the 4th floor because most people don't die unless it's the 8th floor, in case you didn't know that. But it's not If you land in your head, it's not, can't count on it. But an agile parent would say, you know, we're on the 1st and a half floor, and you're going to get hurt, get off of there, right? And then it starts, right? After you get off of it, then you start to say, how am I going to help you to say that to yourself, right? And with what voice you're going to say it to yourself. That's the second step. And that's the co-creation. That's where, if you say to yourself, that's the only thing I say, then you're doing a limit and not helping the child to be part of creating a boundary. Yeah. We're still in science fiction. What?
I'm just thinking, I'm not wondering.
We don't think, that's all we do in this class is think. In case you hadn't noticed, right?
I don't know if it's too much psychoanalyzing, but like some people it's difficult to accept that because they themselves like are so, like got that no so much in them that they think that they will not be able to do it any other way.
Right, so in other words, when you say to your parent, when you have a parent who's saying no, and that's the end of it, you assume that where did they get that from, right? Then the question is, do you want to give your child the same no that you got, which may have been with a few smacks, or do you want to give a no, but a different no? But then you got to make it up. And that's what spouses are for, because, you know, one has a different no than the other, so they can try to think through it together and figure, what are we hoping for our kids? And if we don't know, so we can ask. That's what the world is like. They may ask you, right? But they wouldn't ask you how to do it, or they might, and you would say to them, well, let's find the way that's best for you to do it, right? So that you feel that you're doing better, but that it fits you. You can't become some sort of caricature of a mother, right? You still have to be yourself. When children do things, and they do things quickly, and they do things, and they get to you going, you have to be yourself. The question is whether you want to do something to change how you respond. Does that get us where you were thinking?
I'm just thinking that like I would probably also use what you just said because it's very educational. Like, you know, when a person understands that and you're like, you know.
See, if you have time, you know, when the kids are asleep, this is science fiction because nobody has time. But if you have time, then you say to yourself, I wonder what my child's experiences of the world and of me were today. Right? Because you've given them a certain experience. Is that the experience you wanted to give them? You get tomorrow to change it. You know, it's, nothing is one-off in these things. But the question is whether you're able to reflect on it, whether you're able to say, okay, this is the home, what's it like to be my kid? What's it like to be my kid is a differentiated question. It's not a usual question, but when it happens, then there's an issue of co-creation. See, because even if the child is 2, you're saying what kind of 2-year-old, what kind of, you know, nurture and what kind of limits and what kind of whatever, and what's working and what's not working, what's helping him to grow up, right?
Until what age can you do that?
What's that?
Until what age can you do that?
Until what age do you what?
Do you have that opportunity?
Oh, until yes.
As long as you live?
No. You can muck it up for a long time and straighten it out. Usually that's what happens. People will come to you to try to do that. In other words, you've mucked it up, and you know the kid doesn't listen to the teacher because he just thinks that the teacher is just like his mother, who he thinks hates him. The mother doesn't hate him, but he thinks that the way she says no, which is the way her mother, so he can't accept no from anybody because it's a bad no. Can you fix it? That's what therapy is about. That's what you do with families with kids who don't listen. You help you help the parents to find a different way of talking, because kids who don't listen are not born that way. Right? Kids who don't listen have something they can't listen to, and so there's something that needs to be helped with the listening. Okay, so now we've settled all of child rearing, so we'll go back to the boundaries. Now, let's have a look and see how these 3 issues that Minuchin talks about as systems theory, how they impact on what we've talked about in terms of differentiation. And what we're going to do is, first of all, a review of what we did last time. We're going to create a central triangle. Now, you all know who the central triangle is here. It's David, Caroline, and Claudia. But we're going to reconstruct the central triangle and see how it works, why it has so much power. Because triangle is this sort of a mystical term. How does the triangle have so much power? So if you recall, what we started to do is to say, how do people figure out what people feel towards them in the family? How do you get a map that is clear enough? So if Claudia is saying, how does David feel towards me, which was a bit complex, right? How David feels towards her. But she and David might be able to figure it out. But then there's a question, another question of Claudia wondering how Caroline feels towards me. Caroline's pretty frustrated with Claudia. She's not the daughter that she wanted. But then we have the interesting question. You see, I could figure out what David thinks about me, and I could think about what Mom thinks about me. But how does David think about how Mom thinks towards me? Right? In other words, Caroline is always being critical and telling me that I'm, not doing things right. Does David like that? Does David hate that? How does my father think about how my mother treats me? That sounds like not such a complicated question, but it puts us into deep fog.
Is there any reason why Claudia's arrow is 2 ways to Caroline and David's is 1 way?
Say that again?
I was just wondering, is there any reason, not just wondering, is there any reason why Claudia's arrow is 2 ways?
With Caroline?
Yeah. Is that
It should be 2 ways with David too. All the arrows should be 2. Thank you. Somebody's paying attention to the visuals. All the arrows should be both ways, right? So now how does David think about when Caroline tells me that I'm going the wrong way and I'm never going to grow up right and be a proper woman? How does Dad think about that? He seems to like me, but how does he think about that? So he's against that, he's for that. But then we go one step further and we say, how do I think about Mom and Dad's relationship? That's a big one in families, right? How does a kid think about Mom and Dad's relationship? For example, does Claudia like it when they fight, right? But in addition, how does David feel about how Claudia feels about David and Caroline's relationship? See, we've just done another loop. Now this is, I'm giving you the example because this happens in families, right? This is not rocket science. This is how people think. I said, when Claudia seems happy that they're having a fight, is David happy with the fact that she's happy that they're having a fight? And the answer is, I don't know, right? In other words, the way things are here, it's hard to know what the answer to that could possibly be. But if we impose a central triangle, right, and the central triangle that's stable is a central triangle with this one positive relationship and 2 negative relationships. One positive, remember that from last time? One positive, that's how you'll see families. That's why it's important to know this. That's what you'll see. This is a classical Minutian kind of triangle where there's an alliance, a coalition between David and Claudia. Claudia and Caroline are always fighting, and David and Caroline are sort of distant, right? So the negative could be hot or cold, but it's negative, right? And then if we look at the triangle this way, and we say, okay, if this is the way life is, do we have any questions anymore? Well, let's have a look and see. Let's say David and Caroline have a negative relationship. How does Claudia feel about that? In the triangle? Good. She's happy that that's negative. How does David feel about Claudia seeing that as good? Good. Because he has a coalition with her, right? So David secretly is happy that Claudia is happy when David and Caroline are unhappy, right? Take anything else in the triangle and you'll see that the triangle solves all the problems, right? In other words, let's say Claudia and Caroline are having a fight and David looks at the fight between David and Caroline according to this triangle and says, well, I get something out of that, right? Because I get closer to Claudia. And does Claudia know that David gets something out of the fact that she's fighting? Yeah, right? So no matter where you go, there are no secrets. In other words, the world becomes clear. It becomes functional in a dysfunctional way. It becomes, you now know the answer to everything. But the problem is that No, but that you have to maintain a negative and a negative, and with David and Claudia, it's a covert positive, right? David doesn't say to Caroline, leave her alone, but that's what he implies. Yeah.
But there's a certain assumption that people are understanding what's going on. And in general, when you have a triangle like this, it's exactly the opposite. People are not understanding really all of what you've just asked. People aren't thinking necessarily about it from above.
No, you see, it's fakert. In other words, if you say to yourself, when David and Caroline fight and Claudia is happy about that, how does David feel? The answer is he feels okay about it. And you say, well, why would he feel okay about it? Right? See it from the bottom. That's the.
I'm more asking.
He's saying he doesn't even think about it.
In other words, people don't.
Really thinking about it. Not do they feel okay or why do they feel okay, but are they really thinking?
Of course they are. Caroline, of course, Caroline and Claudia are going at it for the millionth time. David's not having a reaction one way or the other to it. Of course he's having a reaction to it, but he's having his reaction to another relationship. That's what goes on in families. People pay attention to other relationships, right? But it looks like David seems to be okay with the fact that Claudia and Caroline are having it out.
Is that positive or it's just neutral? Like it doesn't.
Usual. In other words, so the therapist, not the family, looks at it and says, if I see this as a triangle, I can understand why this is happening. It's something that happens, but it happens regularly, usual. In other words, Claudia knows when she's having it out with Caroline, she knows that David's going to be okay. Now that may seem strange, but that's how the family works. That she doesn't expect David to come and support Caroline, right? And David's relationship to Caroline is one such that he's likely to say to her, what's your problem with your daughter? Right? Which is negative, right? And so Claudia has this answer from David, which is that it's okay with him that Caroline and Claudia, because he's critical of Caroline about it, and not of Claudia. The way to understand that from the top, the therapist gets these confusing answers, right? So then if you impose the triangle and say, this is how we might explain how this is happening, that'll give you a way of working. That's what we're talking about, focus, right? Because, see, this is going to go around in every possible way. David and Caroline are having a problem, and Claudia is okay with their problem, and David is okay with the fact that she's okay with the problem. David and Claudia are having sort of a little tete-a-tete, and Caroline is negative about the tete-a-tete, and David is fine with the fact that she's negative about it, right? And it keeps happening. What happens is that the triangle is organized this way, makes things keep happening. That's confusing to the therapist. The therapist would say, all right, well, let me go run after this family. So, Caroline and Claudia, so David, stay out of it. Let's do David and Caroline and Claudia. But David's there saying, why would you want to do that? And so I get confused. I say, well, all right, let's do David and Caroline. All right, we're going. But Claudia's there saying, what's the matter with, they should stay different. It's a good thing. I say, well, but your parents, but I, So no matter where you go, you end up with a confusing situation. So the way to be unconfused is to see how it's organized as a system. And it's organized as a system in a central triangle.
I got it.
You got it.
I got it. Everyone.
Anybody on this side got it? Right. Okay. So now what we've added is one simple thing. We already learned from Bowen about a central triangle, right? What we're just adding in here is how central triangles look, one positive and two negatives, and how that works, what power that has. And the power that it has is to keep things predictable. In other words, when you keep things predictable, things don't go out of hand. They're lousy, but they're the same lousy. Remember the complementary cycle with just two? It's no good, but it keeps being the same no good. And so it sustains the system. Everybody knows that it's going to not go out of control, it's going to stay in this crummy control. Yeah?
If David and Claudia have a good relationship, then why is he on a positive when Claudia and Caroline are having a disagreement?
Because that keeps Claudia close to him.
so selfish.
The disagreement keeps,
Yeah,
she needs the father,
yeah.
but he's not like also feeling bad for her?
He should be, but he's not because it's organized this way.
It's so black and white. I'm sure it's mixed
Yeah.
feelings.
always.
Right,
He feels
right.
bad for her, and that's what, he feels bad for her,
Feels bad
that
when
it's
he-
difficult, but that's what but then he can
But then
say,
he's waiting
but then he
for
can
her.
say,
Right.
right, but I'm gonna make it better, or
See-
I'm gonna be the one to come and save her.
Rationalize.
See, David, what do we mean by saying that he sees it as a positive thing that Claudia is having out with Caroline? He will not say to Claudia and Caroline, I want the two of you to find a way to resolve your relationship, and I will do everything I can for you, Claudia, and for you, Caroline, which is moving away from Claudia, moving to Caroline. They would have to be a family therapist to do that, right? That's what we're going to help him to do. But he can't do it because if he could do that, they wouldn't have been in the triangle. See, the triangle functions when there's lack of differentiation or lack of security about co-creation. So here there's no co-creation because it keeps happening again, right?
Are you saying that a central triangle always looks like this? It's never two positives and a negative.
Right, two positives and a negative. Try it with your try it with your friends sometimes. It's not stable. It's not stable when it's two positives and a negative. It's only stable when it's what?
Is there such thing as a triangle with three positives, or is that a triangle?
If it's three positives, then what will happen is that one of them will be more positive than the other. Think of your girlfriends. In other words, think of a group of three people, any three people, right? And so everybody loves everybody. Let's take David, Caroline, and Claudia and turn them into friends, right? So there we have, there was a TV series that was all based on this, right? Friends. David, Caroline, and Claudia are friends. They were all the same age, it's not, you know. And so David and Caroline have a nice relationship, but David wonders if Claudia doesn't like Caroline more than she likes him. He wonders. And Claudia has a good relationship with David, but she wonders whether Caroline likes her to be so close to David, or whether Caroline feels that if she's close to David, she's going to be far from him. That's all you need, right? Now, those are human insecurities. They happen in relationships. In other words, when you break a triangle, and when David says, my relationship with Claudia, my relationship with Caroline is independent of the relationship of Claudia and Caroline, then you've raised the differentiation, right? Then you have a triad. But if it's dependent in any way, see, the plus and the minus is just a way of, you know, the schematic is black and white. But if you make one relationship dependent on another relationship in any way, you create a triangle which is messy, and the triangle tends to organize around the two of us are close and you're a little bit out. And why does that have so much power? Because it makes things stable. Right? And so when you make things stable, you can say it's crummy stable, but it's stable. It's not going to go out of control. It's going to stay the same way. And you know, with girlfriends, you know what's going to happen, right? That there's one that's positive, and then it's going to flip to another one that's positive. It's going to have the same structure. Whoever is out is going to be in, and the one who's in is going to be out, but it'll have the same structure. And that structure is a tendency to be secure. There was another question? Yeah. Sarah.
I have two questions. First of all, I don't understand.
Well, you're two people, so.
Helps give me brains, or not.
When my daughter was that old, she went with my wife to Minushin to study family therapy. So, she became a social worker, but not a family therapist. Yeah.
I don't understand the negative between the Claudia and Caroline. I know that they fight.
Right.
That's why it's negative. But Claudia is feeling. It doesn't go both ways. I don't understand the second part. When Claudia fights with Carolyn,
Right.
whatever.
Claudia feels Carolyn doesn't love me.
Right.
Carolyn feels I failed with Claudia.
I what?
Failed.
Failed.
And then why is that negative? Like, a thing that goes back and forth between the two of them.
Yeah. It's
But with Claudia and David, we explained how it makes Carolyn
Oh,
mad.
how is it positive with David and Claudia? That's the secret of secret coalitions. In other words, Claudia and David don't say to each other, you'll get to it. Have you gotten to that part already? Oh, okay. So you know the secret, right? David and Claudia have something that has to break apart. You see, now the interesting thing in a coalition is that the weakest part of the coalition is the positive part. Nobody jumped out of their seat. The weakest part of the coalition.
That's the problem.
The weakest part of the coalition is the positive part.
The positive part is the reason why the negative parts are happening.
Yes, right. In other words, you got that too, right? You're on a roll. David and Claudia have a secret coalition. A secret coalition. This is good as a mechitza, nobody can see that you do that. David and Claudia have a secret coalition because they're insecure about their relationship. They're insecure about their relationship. David doesn't really know how to be a father to Claudia. Claudia doesn't really know what David is all about. So that they're the least secure, they can't... What's that?
It's not spoken about.
It's not spoken about. It's not even thought about in this family. So it happens because they're insecure about understanding each other.
If it's spoken about, then it's very different.
When it's spoken, yeah. When it's when it's an open coalition, it's open for discussion and negotiation. When it's secret, so David and Claudia, what?
And then why is it a plus?
Because it's a secret plus. In other words, the two of them are allied, as it were, against Caroline. But their relationship, you see, if you say to yourself, can David and Claudia tolerate conflict? Well, David and Caroline are in conflict all the time. That's not a bad thing in a relationship. And Claudia and Caroline are in open warfare all the time. That's not a bad thing in a relationship. It's up there, right? But David and Claudia can't tolerate conflict. And so they create out of their insecurity a secret coalition, which is the two of us, we just don't have any conflict, and we put all of our conflict out onto Caroline. My conflict, your conflict, it all goes through Caroline. So the ones that are alive are the ones that are messy. And the one that is fine is the one that is weakest. And that's a very important point to understand when you're treating a family, because a lot of times, you'll go into the family and say, aha, David and Claudia have a secret coalition. We're going to break it. You can't do that, right? What you can do is to say, your relationship is very, very, very delicately balanced. You never have any conflict, the two of you. So you're protecting each other. But that doesn't mean that it's a secure relationship. So you can imagine, and we're going to get to that the beginning of next semester, that when we change Claudia and Caroline, it's going to change David and Claudia. But we're not going to start by changing David and Claudia.
Oh, you're not?
Not going to start from there. We'll get to that.
At the base of the problem.
Break the only plus. Break the system.
Did not start
Well, now we're into an interesting question.
Carolyn and Claudia?
What? We'll get to that.
But one more question.
What?
One more question. Why does it stay stable?
It stays stable to protect
Carolyn's
David.
negative with both David and with Claudia. Why would she stay in the system?
Why does what?
Caroline.
Stay in the system?
Yes.
Well,
If you think about it, she's negative all right, every direction.
the truth is that the family came in with Caroline one step out of the system. She's just about had it. She's an American, in the Midwest, so she didn't say that, but she's just about out of the system. Because it's hard, she's a negative with David, a negative with Claudia, but they're her people. In other words, she's part of this system, and this is the way.
They also need her.
They need her for sure, so they're not letting her out so much, right? In other words, they'll confuse her. They'll say, "Come closer," bam. That happens in families, right? Come closer.
Strong connection.
that is understanding the
What?
that is understanding the circle relationship between David and Caroline. Makes you understand why it's still going.
Right. In other words, if you recall, there's a complementary cycle between David and Caroline that I showed you last week, or 2 weeks ago. And instead of yelling at Caroline, he yells at Claudia, and she yells at Claudia, and that makes it, yeah.
Does every family have a triangle? And are they
Right.
triangles that are...
So in a higher differentiated family, the tendency to triangles is there because it's a human tendency. It's a human tendency. But they don't get fixed. In other words, they may be one day like this and the other way will be like that. In other words, if we hocus pocus, raise the differentiation in David and Caroline and Claudia, and we say that, Claudia comes home late one night and Caroline says to David, listen, you see that our daughter is not listening to me. Help me. And he says, well, I don't think that you're doing the right thing. And Caroline says, that is not helping me. I want you to help me with my relationship with my daughter. Do you want to help me with my relationship with my daughter? Or do you want to just criticize it and then pretend to be close to her? And David says, what some of you have been saying here, oh, I think I got it, right? Because he's listening. In other words, there's a co-creation that still happens between David and Caroline. And then David, when Claudia comes home, David and Claudia are waiting for her. And they say, we've had a talk, the two of us, and we realize that we've been confusing you, and we want to stop confusing you. The two of us feel that your punishment is you're grounded for the next 3 seconds without a phone, because 4 seconds is a death sentence, but 3 seconds, and so and we're doing this because we want to help you to understand that you still have parents who still think about what's good for you, and the two of us think that way. And Claudia says to Caroline, you've taken my father away from me, huh? And David says, no, she's helped me to understand my role. My role here is, together with Caroline, to help you to grow up. And if we make mistakes, we'll make them together. And if it's a mistake, we'll fix it. Does that sound like science fiction? See, now that would be a more differentiated family, right? You see what happens, that if you have a family that told you they did that, listen to them, because they're telling you how to be a family therapist. Family therapy is what goes on in families that do not get stuck in triangles. Therapy for us is when...
also change people? You're saying like, not just like change with Claudia, but the triangle could be with Don one day and Laura one day, and like...
Yeah, when we free people from a central triangle, what we do is we free them for co-creation. And that's what happens. Is that fair to say that that's what happens in the Bryce family? In other words, that we have Claudia and Caroline creating a new relationship. We have David and Claudia creating a new relationship, and finally we have David and Caroline creating a new relationship. It just takes time, and it has to go in a certain order depending on how the conflict is structured. But the whole point of getting rid of triangles is not to restructure the family, it's to allow dyads to co-create. That's a function. That's a function of dyads, to co-create. Okay, we have...
Can there be a triangle that's 2 pluses and 1 minus?
It won't be stable. It won't be stable, because the 2 pluses will be worrying about who's more plus than the other one, right? Whereas there's 1 plus and 2 minuses, you answer that question. Just, look. It's a little, it's a simple geometry, but just think about you try to learn in a threesome instead of a chavrusa.
Oh,
Yeah, so who's smarter and who's a little smarter? Who's going to get the tosas first? Who's going to be, who thinks he's Rabbeinu Tam over here? And, those sorts of things. Yeah.
I'm wondering what happens when, I would imagine that...
Since you've had, Nasimone fall, you can wonder.
I'm thinking of a family where this dynamic exists, but all the kids have this dynamic. With
all the what?
So I'm wondering, can a triangle be bigger than 3? Like all of that, the father has this secret
with all the kids.
All the kids, they all kind of don't like the mom or whatever, and the mom and dad have problems and whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is that one big?
Well, see,
or is it like a 5? Is it like a pencil?
It's a bunch of overlapping triangles, but if you say to yourself, what shall we do as the therapist, right? So then you would probably talk about it as one triangle. In other words, you would probably say to the dad, the way to talk to a dad who's insecure about his role, creates a triangle out of insecurity, right, is to say, now that you've established what feels good between you and your kids, come here, sit with me, and we're going to help your wife to have also a good relationship with the kids. So he comes and sits with me, you put the mother with the kids, all hell breaks loose,
right.
And then you say to dad, what shall we do that would help your wife to be a better mother? What can you do to help her? Don't replace her. That doesn't help her. It weakens her. What can you do that helps her? And usually what he ends up saying is, tell me how I can help you. I'll do anything. I want you to succeed. I want you to succeed. And then, what the problem is going to be is that when she starts to succeed, the kids are going to say to him, "You're a wimp," and then we'll have to have her help him. Right? You had a question, Avital?
Sometimes the central triangle can be with someone out of the family.
Say that again.
I'm thinking of a family where the couple, like there is like a Rav who like is helping them, and I think he's like
Triangulated.
Right. If you remember, little Hans's father and the professor Freud had a triangle against the mother, right? And that's part of why that treatment didn't work. In other words, therapists are always in danger of being a triangle. If some of you have had the experience of people who may not necessarily think about triangles, but want to do good, to help a family, to give assistance. Some Rabbanim, some Rebbitzins, are called in to do that. There are some who have an exquisite intuition about triangles, and there are some that don't. The ones that have an exquisite understanding of triangles know how to help the family without becoming a triangle. And those who don't become part of the triangle.
Therapists,
right.
That's the danger, right?
And therapists, why are we learning about triangles? Because the triangle is the lady who comes in to talk to her therapist about the idiot that she's married to, right? And then you have an automatic triangle, and you say to yourself, oh, I wonder how this is helping. I wonder what other triangles are like this as well. And instead of saying, now she may come in to say, I need to understand myself. Fine. But if she comes in and the main thing she wants to talk about is what the idiot that she's married to, then you can assume that you're being induced into the triangle and that it's not going to be very helpful to just see her. We have to have her help him to be a little less of an idiot and maybe have her feel less rejected and so forth, So the triangle is always a danger in therapy. It's always a danger in child therapy. The danger is the mother comes in and says, fix my kid, and the kid and the therapist make a triangle against the mother, that the mother can't do things. The point of child therapy is to help the mother to be a better mother. Sometimes you do things in the room first so the kid can allow it, but the point of it is to put the family back together again. Yeah?
So as a continuation of that question, so when you see that is happening and you have a relationship with the Rav where you can call him and say to him like,
say it again, what?
Not being helpful.
Yeah.
Would you do that? Would you say that?
Doing couples, what? I don't understand the question.
I'm saying when you have a couple,
yeah,
right, and they are in therapy.
And they're what?
They are in therapy.
A couple in therapy, right? Got that.
And they're trying, like they're getting the Rav, like he's basically like being like there's a central triangle with this Rav.
Right.
And you know the Rav, and you can ask him to like, is that something you would do kind of thing, or?
Well, I didn't follow what the question is. What would you
call a Rav and like ask him to back off if he was creating triangles?
Yes. I mean, you wouldn't do it by saying you're not a good Rav. You would say, I'm a therapist, you're a Rav. There's something I'm seeing that you weren't trained to see. And when I'm seeing it, I'd like to share it with you because some of the stuff that would work with other families, see, nobody gives advice that never works any time, right? The problem is when it works with one family, you think it's going to work for all families. So with this particular couple, it's it would be better if you leave it alone and let me take care of it. I'll explain it to you later if they want me to. Right, and the average person who's involved in Eitzot would be happy to say, that's what professionals are for. Everybody has their own role. So now let's just take a look at how it works when we apply Minuchin's systems theory. See, Minuchin's theory says there's hierarchy and there's boundaries and there's subsystems. So let's look at the hierarchy. Here we are, we're taking the hierarchy and we're applying it to the Bryce family. Look what happens. We're talking to ourselves and we're saying, I'm doing hierarchy. What's happening to the central triangle? See, this is the central triangle is what we called last time a perverse triangle that crosses hierarchical bounds, right? So now, when we say, David and Caroline, I want you to think about the punishments for for Claudia, and until you've decided what the two of you agree on are the right punishments that would be good for her, we're really not going to go any further. And then Don makes noise and you say, shut up, and Laura makes noise and say, shut up, and Claudia makes noise and say, shut up, right? And that's not what Whitaker did. But let's say we're doing it with hierarchy. What happens to the central triangle? Since it's a perverse triangle, applying hierarchy disrupts the central triangle, right? So Mnuchin says to himself, I'm doing structural therapy and I'm doing parental authority. Guess what? When you're doing parental authority, you're interrupting a central triangle, right? So you're doing Bohemian therapy, and Mnuchin, you're doing therapy, and there's a different way of looking at it, okay? Now, what would happen if we say, let's talk about subsystems, right? And so we're going to talk, let's say, about the parents as a spouse system, as a subsystem. And David and Caroline, we want them to function as parents, function of the subsystem, right? So what would we do? The same thing. The only difference is that instead of saying the two of you impose authority, say the two of you think about how you want the family to look like in a month. And then I'll help you to get there. Just decide as parents how you want it to look in a month. That's your function. When the kids interrupt that, you say the spouse system is functioning here, and so we want the boundary to protect the spouse system. And what have you done? You've interrupted the central triangle. If the central triangle is a perverse triangle that crosses hierarchical lines, and it almost always is, then anytime you apply subsystems, for example, let's say you said to David, Claudia, Don, and Laura, as a way of doing it, not just as a tool, as you said before. Let's say you say to them, okay, how about if the three of you have a chat about how you would like the home to look like in a month? And David says, what do you mean? What they want. So yeah, they're three bright kids, and they have how about if we let them talk? They seem to like to talk to each other. And Caroline says, well, Claudia can't be part of it because she's no good. And you say to Claudia, well, that's how her mother thinks. Caroline, so you say to Caroline, that's what her mother thinks right now. We understand that, but that's not how Don and Laura think about it. They don't care what time she comes home. They're actually sort of excited about it. So how about if the three of you talk? So if you make the siblings talk, you've interrupted the central triangle, right? In other words, you're doing something that is inconsistent with the structure of the triangle. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to place a value on all of this, where if you say to the siblings, the subsystem of the siblings, how would you like it to look? Well, they may say, well, we all want to do what Claudia is doing. We all want to come in anytime we want. We're going to make the decisions. That's what we want.
No. It's not a decision. It's what you would like it to be. Okay. Then, since you're dealing with subsystems, then you deal with the parents, but the two of them together, saying, I guess your kids want to return the world to tohu vavohu. How do you think? You know, your three kids think that the best that the family can be is a total mess. How would you like to do about that? And David and Caroline said to each other, "Oi, Gewalt, you know, we've managed to get them to look at Claudia as something desirable. It's because of how we've been treating Claudia. So here's how we want the family to be." And then you create across the boundary between the parents and the siblings, right? It's not that the siblings then decide what to do. It's that the siblings have a place to talk about, but the truth is that that's not going to happen because children do not like tohu vavohu. In other words, if you say to them, how about if you have a home where there's no rules at all? Most kids will say, great, for 3.5 seconds, and then freak out and say, no rules at all? How am I going to know what to do? In other words, that kind of, vision of snot-nosed children all, dancing around their parents who are, burning at the stake, that's not what kids do. What kids want is a family that's safe for them. And to make it safe for them, they know that it's not safe for them. So, for example, what's going to happen is, and Claudia's going to say, since I'm the oldest one, I decide. And then it's going to be, same old, same old. So the idea that kids are all going to rush to a revolution is a fantasy that a lot of parents have, but it doesn't understand the children. Children rush to revolt in order to push the boundaries and make their parents better parents, but more age appropriate for what they need right now. For example, the three of them may say to David and Claudia, you guys haven't changed the rules since Claudia was 3. Laura wasn't even born then. And since then, you just do the same old things. How about an upgrade? That's more like what you would get from kids. And then David and Caroline have to say to themselves, an upgrade. That would mean we would have to talk to each other. Uh-oh. Can we talk to each other? And the therapist says, look, I'll help you. Because your kids want you to talk to each other. Your kids want you to succeed as parents. There aren't children who do not want their parents to succeed as parents. There are children who don't yet believe it's possible, right? And that's where the therapy comes in. Yeah.
This you say to them with the children in the room?
Sorry?
This you say to them with the children in the room?
Okay, so in America in the 70s, you do it with the children in the room. In a Haredi family, I don't know. You have to, ask a Rav and not me. But it may be that the parents have to talk with the children separately. But let's say that your children have things to say that are not exactly right now, kibbud av v'em. So then you might say to yourself, are we on the way to it? Or if we're not there yet, we can't talk about it. That's a therapeutic decision. Because usually you're not yet perfect, no matter where you are.
Letting the children say something that's different. What you're saying is that you tell the parents, like you bring up issues of the parents in front of the children. And that is something that I'm
Okay, there's a cultural rage there that's very broad. There are some people who would say, never, never do that. And so you would say to the kids, okay, out of the room, now your parents are going to talk about it, right? And I'm going to help them to do something different, but you're not going to listen to it. Or some parents would say, how am I going to teach them to be parents if they don't know how I'm a parent? And why would anybody think that a parent at any given moment is perfect? Like, what does that have to do with anything? That's a different part of the cultural range, where you say, I'm going to teach you how to become a better parent by becoming a better parent myself. Now, becoming a better parent is less than perfect, so it depends where you look at it, right?
Perfect. I'm looking at it differently. I'm not looking at it from that point of view. I'm looking at it more from the point of view of like certain things are between parents, and you can get into subjects that you won't do next to the children. And it's more belonging in couple therapy, which I don't think is appropriate for children to be a part of.
Right. It's a cultural range there, and each of you needs to find where your range is and where your client's range is. There are parents who may, look awfully frum, but think that changing is a good thing. That's what you teach your children to do, is to change. And there are some parents who say, no, that's something that's private. Children shouldn't be present when their parents are in the process of change. They just need to see that there's a result. That's not the question you were asking?
Yeah, never mind. Okay.
What? So what was your question?
Not everyone's going to have that sensitivity. Meaning some
I'm
people
not
don't
talking
mind.
about changing, and I'm not talking about
what are you saying?
I'm talking about certain things that, like, when you get into the relationship between the parents,
Right.
like couples therapy, sometimes it can be going into things between the parents that should be like.
That's perfectly agree with you.
So
You have to evaluate the situation based on your preferences, based on the family, like
You're not exactly going to talk about it into the life family. You talk about upgrades.
The cultural range, as you know, the edge of culture is always in America, and usually at the edge of America in California. So in the 70s in California, the assumption was that how do you teach children to be sexual partners if their parents don't talk about their sexual life in front of their children? That's the far edge of it. That didn't catch on very well. It was, that was considered to be desirable in the far edge of the cultural range. The cultural range in the middle is usually that at least your emotional relationship, some of it, the kids don't see that there's a problem, so why shouldn't they see how you make a solution? Some people will say, well, you shouldn't see the problem, but that's not going to work because they see the problem. So then you have to negotiate when you see that you're not present when you fix things, or you are present when you fix things. That's going to be a cultural range. Some people will see it as possible, and some people will see it as not, and you'll manage the door of the room according to what's possible for the family. Now, one last point about boundaries. The main mistake that Mnuchin made in theory was that he overvalued the boundaries as the goal and undervalued the co-creation in the subsystem as the goal. Mnuchin didn't make up the system. He imported it from living systems, but not human systems. And living systems, which means like ecology, like behemoths, and human beings work a little different. So he imported this system that said that the issue is the boundary between, right? And he didn't see boundary as something that people co-create. He saw it as something that's more like a limit. And so he said that the limits can be either too open or too closed. And so you see, according to Mnuchin, the range of families are going to be like this. There'll be a normal family with normal boundaries, right? And then there'll be the ones that are too open, the ones that are too rigid. Now, that looks good if you're an Aristotelian, right? Because you're in the middle, the golden mean, So in other words, there's the two edges and the normal in the middle. However, if you look at it, you say to yourself, as somebody once did, he said, well, I was treating these families with drug addictions, difficult, low differentiated families, and 1 minute, their boundaries are open, and the next minute, their boundaries are rigid. I can give you an example from, I used to treat methadone addicts in the Bronx, and somebody would say, 40 with a lot of tattoos and a lot of total mess, and they would say, well, I talk to my mother every day, 4 times, and she tells me what to do. So it looks like the boundaries are too open. And then he says, but I never listen to her because I don't care what she thinks, and she just bothers me. So then, well, he keeps going between open and rigid. I guess he's normal, right? Or you can say that the boundaries is not the issue. In other words, you can't classify people according to the boundaries. You classify them according to what works in the boundaries. And so if you look at, if you look at the differentiation of self, it's not a balanced system. You're not in the middle between this and that, right? So it's always can get better differentiation. So let's take Mnuchin's grid and quetch it in the middle. See, making it, quetching it and turn it on its side, and make it the tail of Bowen. In other words, what we're going to have is that when boundaries are not functional, they may be either too open or too rigid, or both. That's what Bowen says, right? That there's low differentiation is either the undifferentiated ego mass or the cutoff, right? So boundaries, the fact that they're open or rigid is a sign of low differentiation. And so the issue is not to change the boundary, the question is what you do with the boundary, which is the co-creation that's possible when you raise the differentiation. So as a result, you see that in Bowen's theory, Mnuchin is taken care of here, but it's not like you have to be in the middle. And when you think that you have to be in the middle, the big difficulty with thinking that you have to be in the middle is you may think that you know what the middle is, right? And that's where the women caught Mnuchin by the tail and said, how do you know what how it's supposed to be? How do you know what the middle is? Nobody knows what the middle is. The question isn't the middle, the question is what works. The question is what function of the boundaries preserves the function of the subsystems, where the differentiation can rise, because it's in the function of the subsystems where co-creation takes place. Did we lose the camera for just this point?
No.
Oh, okay, so that's good. And if you understand this, then you didn't understand it. Right. So I'll say it one more time. You see, you'll hear all the time, the Minuchin says there are families that are enmeshed and there are families that are what he called disengaged. Now, Minuchin wrote a book about disengaged families. It was called Families of the Slum. Minuchin was from a middle-class family. He didn't know anything about the slums, but he could speak Spanish. That helped. And he wrote a book about the kids in this residential treatment. I can't compete with this. You have to just put it back onto. Okay. So he wrote a book about the families in the slums, where he said that the families in the slums are disengaged. And the kids that were in this residential treatment center in upstate New York and Wiltwyck, they come from disengaged families. He took it back 20 years later. He said, I didn't understand these families at all. They're not disengaged. They have a different culture. But the term disengaged as a way of classifying families sticks with us, that the family is too disengaged or it's too enmeshed. But you see, that way, you say, in the middle, that's what it has to be. But the issue isn't the middle. The issue is the function. In other words, that the boundaries have to be functional. They have to create a boundary that works for the subsystems, so the subsystems can be the place where co-creation takes place and differentiation can rise. That's where the family is created, within the subsystems. The boundaries simply protect the subsystems. It's not the function, it's the protection. It's what makes it work. As a result, the boundaries could be both too rigid and too cut off, because if you swallow each other, or if you turn your backs on each other, either way, you're not co-creating, right? Yeah.
But it's only, you said, between subsystems of co-creation, but between parents and child there's co-creation.
Oh, yeah.
Even though there's a boundary, technically.
No, a parent-child is a subsystem.
Oh, it's a different subsystem.
Yeah, where the parent creates the child, but who creates the parent? You weren't my parent before. You never, took care of me when I was 6 before you're doing it now. Who's teaching you how to do that? Who's teaching you to be the parent that's right for me right now? It's mutual, right? In other words, the kids are creating the parents are creating unless there was somebody who happened to have been born knowing how to be the correct parent for absolutely every child possible. But I haven't met somebody like that. Some people who thought they were, but it's always a co-creation. But whatever functions going on, if it's co-creational, it works in reality. If it's not co-creational, then it doesn't. So you see the main difference here between Bowen and Minuchin? If you're doing Minuchin therapy, you can get it right? And that was one of the great and unfortunate fantasies of Minuchin therapy, that I know that your boundaries are to the right or to the left. I'm going to put them to where they are, and then the family is fixed. The illness is cured, the boundaries are correct. And what happened is that then the families went away, and a couple of years later they came back. But they couldn't come back for therapy because they were already fixed. So how could they come back? But if you deal with differentiation, there's always room to raise the differentiation. There's always a new struggle, there's always a new challenge, there's always something else to do. And then the boundaries need to be readjusted, not to be just right, but to be functional for how the family can co-create itself now with new challenges. So that's, I think, enough for today. Everybody totally confused? You may be a little confused. Okay. All right.